Okay, so this year marks the 125th birth anniversary of revolutionary artist and freedom fighter Paul Robeson. And we are celebrating Robeson this year in India as well as in the US. And today we are joined by Dr. Anthony Monteiro, um, with whom we will discuss some of Robeson's ideas as well as his life. And we are choosing to celebrate Robeson this year because we feel that he is a figure for our times. And in celebrating him, we are also connecting ourselves to the legacy of people all over the world who defended and celebrated Paul Robeson when he was being persecuted by the American government. And this included people such as Indira Gandhi, Romesh and Perin Chandra, MC Chagla in India, who were involved with the celebration of Paul Robeson's 60th birthday. And I'd just like to introduce Dr. Monteiro for those who don't know him. Dr. Monteiro is a scholar and revolutionary who has spent his life in the struggle for Black freedom and the peace movement. He served on the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the US, and he's a Du Boisian scholar. He has worked on solidarity work with African liberation movements and has also been active in the anti-apartheid movement. Thank you, Doc, for joining us and taking out time to do this today. So I just want to begin by asking you, as you know, today still, I think Paul Robeson's name remains buried and he remains an attacked figure. And especially younger people, some of the younger generation don't even know his name. And so I want to begin by asking you if you could speak a little about Paul Robeson and who he was, and why it is important for us to look back at his life in 2023.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Nanditha, for inviting me for this interview. And of course, as you were saying, Paul Robeson was beloved by humanity. He had transcended national borders and had become as we would say, a tribune of all peoples fighting for freedom and democracy, be they in the United States, the Welsh miners, the Spanish fighters for democracy during the fight against fascism in Spain. He was a uncompromising anti-Nazi and helped to build the world's united front against fascism, against Nazism. He defended the Soviet Union. He was, from the very outset of his conscious political life, a fighter for the freedom of African nations. He was a champion of the Indian independence movement, of Gandhi, of Nehru, of the Chinese revolutionaries. I don't think we have ever seen in this country, and maybe in the world, a political figure who so embraced the aspirations of humanity as did Paul Robeson. In that sense, and I agree with you, that he is a person for our time, but for the future. And just from the standpoint of his character, I think I would describe him as a complete human being. A complete human being who was always working to improve his capacity to stand up for the people of the world. And, how did he go about improving himself? Well, one thing is that he sought to know the essence of the great civilizations of the world. And that essence for him was to be discovered in the folk traditions, the music, the art, the food, the languages of the people. So he learned all of these languages so that he could sing the songs of many peoples in their languages. It is estimated that he was familiar with or spoke 25 languages, a good part of them being African languages. But Emma Goldman, the great Russian revolutionary, said that Paul Robeson spoke Russian like a Russian. He loved the Russian language. And he felt very interesting. His linguistic studies led him to believe that the Slavic languages were connected to the languages of Central Africa, such as those spoken in the Congo, that there was a very ancient link between the languages and cultures of Central Africa and those of Central and Eastern Europe, that is the Slavic peoples. And that drew him to the Russian language, to Russian literature, to Russian poetry, to Russian music. And he wanted to get at the, how would you say, that originary moment when humanity realizes itself as human. And that led him logically to the conclusion that world peace was not just necessary to preserve physical life or modern civilization, but the foundations of everything that is human. Everything that is human. I don't think there has ever been a figure, at least in the modern world, who is like Paul Robeson, that equals Paul Robeson. And if I could just say one other thing, it's always a controversy, even within the Communist Party. Was Paul Robeson a card-carrying member of the Communist Party? Maybe yes, maybe not. There were many communists who could not publicly declare their political allegiances. However, Paul Robeson was friends with, comrades with most of the leaders of the US Communist Party, ideologically and theoretically, philosophically. It is no question that Paul Robeson was a materialist, a dialectician, a historical materialist. He agreed with Marxism on almost every essential of its philosophy. He agreed in no uncertain terms with Lenin, with the path of the Russian Revolution and the building of socialism in what became the Soviet Union. He was a man of the people and influenced every figure that of the middle of the 20th century, every figure, especially in the Black movement, was touched by and influenced by and looked up to Paul Robeson. And I'm talking about figures like Martin Luther King Jr. You cannot imagine Martin Luther King Jr. without the zeitgeist created by Paul Robeson. Rosa Parks, A. Philip Randolph, I would even say the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X. While Malcolm X was in prison, he had two heroes, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Paul Robeson. And it goes on, and to have his name erased, to have him diminished, is an act, a serious act of counter-revolution against the people, carried out by the ruling elite of this country. And of course, I feel a certain closeness to Paul Robeson, not only because of my politics and my political associations and knowing people who were mentored by him that knew him personally, but Paul Robeson spent the last years of his life in Philadelphia and quietly living here. And so, Philadelphia is my city. And to have Paul Robeson spend the last years of his life here is a great tribute to our city.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Doc. And, sometimes I feel that it's very difficult for people who live outside of the US to understand the effects of McCarthyism on American society and, the viciousness of the American ruling elite. And as you mentioned, I mean, Robeson was heavily persecuted for standing up to anti-communist propaganda and refusing to bend to the Cold War. And just for people who don't know, his passport was taken away from him. He was not allowed to travel. There was a smear campaign against him, and it affected his, ability to earn a livelihood. And so I just want to ask you, what was his response to this persecution from the ruling elite? And what is there for us to learn from his life and from this history?
Yeah. Phew, it's so emotional to think about it. He dealt with the Cold War and the reactionary forces in this country the way that he dealt with everything, heroically.
Right.
And when he was brought before the Committee on Un-American Activity in the Senate, he reminded these white men that his father was a slave, that his ancestors had been brought here from Africa, and that it was his people who built this country. And he was not going anywhere, and he was not bending to the threats of anti-revolutionaries, anti-democratic forces. The more I think about it, Nanditha, the more it is clear to me that American democracy, or the potentiality of American democracy, has never recovered from the attacks upon Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. And to understand the Black freedom movement of the 50s and 60s in particular, you almost have to see it as not only a fight for civil rights, which it was, but in its deepest sense, a fight to recover the democratic vision of Robeson. And all of those freedom fighters, especially the Rosa Parks, the Martin Luther Kings, the Vernon Johns, I mean, we could go on and on. They knew Robeson. They knew what had happened to Paul Robeson. And they fought without saying it in his name. And your point is well taken. And this is what the Free School is attempting to do. To say to our people and to the young generation, while we fight against the immediate expressions of repression and anti-democracy and for peace in our country, we're also fighting to recover the great legacy of Paul Robeson. We really are. Because, in fighting for Paul Robeson, we're fighting for that new people. You know, as James Baldwin says, we are marching to achieve our country, to reclaim our country. And that's what Baldwin was saying. To achieve our country meant to reclaim our country from the military industrial complex, from the corporate state, from imperialism. And we do this, in Robeson's sense, in alliance with humanity itself. And this is what we're fighting for here in the United States. It is a great legacy, a great tradition that we have. And Paul Robeson maybe is, I mean, maybe the greatest exponent of this.
Yeah. And I mean, on the other side of this battle, at least ideologically, I feel is the American university. And, you know, I mean,
Yes.
the big question, I think, even, for example, in Indian society, what is the character of the American university? And I think it's also tied to this question of McCarthyism. So I just wanted to ask you if you could comment on that.
Yeah, and you know, it's very interesting. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just compare the period of the 1950s and McCarthyism to what's going on now. I would say we live in a far more repressive environment for ideas and thought and politics today than back then. And this is reflected, as you point out, and I think accurately, the undoing of the great American universities as centers of democratic dissent, democratic debate, political dissent, and so on. In the last maybe 10, maybe more years, the universities have been completely taken over by the billionaire class, the representatives of the ruling elite. And as a consequence, the American people no longer have confidence in universities or in professors or experts because they feel that the universities have been politically corrupted.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, Doc, that this is also, you know, the erasure of Robeson is tied so deeply with the attacks on Du Bois as well as Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
And I mean, the university is really at the center of it.
Yes.
But like you mentioned, the American people, I think people all over the world are trying to understand the current crisis in American society and also the mood of people within the US in this time. And, you know, reading Robeson recently, again, I've come to see his work with a new light because I feel that more than anybody else, he was really an ardent defender of the working class. And he really stood up for the poor. And, you know, even on this question of race, he was always clear that there was this possibility of an anti-racist consciousness among the workers. And so how do you think that, you know, relates to this time? And can you explain the current moment in the US for people outside of the US?
Yeah, well, you know, again, Nanith, I want to thank you for the way you posed the question. It's very important, especially that we know that Robeson defended the working class and always believed in giving working people a fighting chance, that the fire of his most passionate criticism was towards the ruling elite and not to working people. And he was a defender of the democratic traditions of working people as a whole. And he understood the Black worker as central to the working class's realization of itself as a class. This is very important. I hope that makes sense. He had this dialectical understanding of the working class. Yes, there were multiple parts of it. There were different ethnic and racial groups that composed the American working class. There were gender differences and so on. But for him, the working class was to be understood in its becoming itself in the struggle against its exploiters and oppressors. And at the center of that were Black workers, what we call the formerly enslaved proletariat. That insight, even people celebrating Robeson these days, they celebrate a hollow statue which they've made, which they've constructed. They are not celebrating Paul Robeson because they take away what is essential to understanding him, and that is his ideological, theoretical, philosophical groundings. And indeed, I feel like you, that Paul Robeson, his thinking, the way he lived, his political practice, helps us to think about not only the crisis, but a solution to the crisis. You know, I know it is difficult for people who do not live in the United States to fully understand what is going on, especially because the propaganda of the ruling elite stretches all over the world. And, you know, the forces who dissent against their propaganda in the United States don't have anywhere near the capacity to put our views forward. But we are on the cusp of a significant, if not profound, political realignment in this country. This is because the American people and the American working people in the first instance are rejecting the rule of the ruling elite. Every poll, opinion poll, survey poll that is taken shows that the American people have no confidence, first of all, in President Biden. You know, 54% of the American people oppose him. 70% of the electorate say that they don't want him to run in 2024. But if you take the Congress, the positive ratings for the Congress of the United States is under 20%. Universities, this is what we call a crisis of legitimacy, where the American people and the American working class and the poor reject the rule of the corporatists, the billionaire class, and the elite. This is forcing a political realignment. No one fully understands the day-to-day realities of this. In other words, we know what's going on a macro level. But let us say we go to Butler, Pennsylvania. We don't know how it is manifesting in that deindustrialized city. If we go to different parts of Philadelphia, which Nanditha, you know quite well, if we go to different parts of Philadelphia, how this plays out, we're not yet certain. You know, we pick things up in conversation. How deep is the separation of working people from the ruling elite. We just don't know the intensity of it. We do know with Trump on the one side and now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcing that he is running in the Democratic primaries against Joe Biden. We see two figures politically who are against the war policies of the US ruling elite. They're against the anti-working class austerity policies of the ruling elite. They are, and Robert F. Kennedy is very explicit and very clear on his claim that the United States is threatened by an internal coup d'etat, a domestic coup d'etat, which probably, I think he says, happened with the assassination of his uncle, John F. Kennedy, the president, and his father, Robert F. Kennedy, that was a coup d'etat. And he also includes the assassination of Martin Luther King in that. A coup d'etat against the people and against democracy that has eventuated in this completely authoritarian, almost one-party rule that we have today. So I would say to people throughout the world, if you want to understand democracy today in the United States, you have to understand the opposition to the ruling elite of the American people. Don't look to elite narratives about democracy. Please. I would just say my final thing on this. You know, it's one of those times in a country, to use the words of Antonio Gramsci, where the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born, or is having difficulty being born. The new democracy, a new people's democracy, that is also a democracy upholding peace and the welfare of every American citizen, will go through many ups and downs, many transitionary stages. But I have confidence, believe me, I really do, that the US people, the American people who are reinventing themselves even as we speak, even as we speak, will find a way out of this. And I think the first step is rejecting the government and the rule of the ruling elite, and they have done that. Now the other side is, where do we go from here?
Right. Yeah, and I think the last few months or now years, well, over a year, the war in Ukraine has been a large factor in American politics. And recently, I know that the American military has started building military bases in the Philippines as a way to threaten China. They're also sending nuclear submarines to South Korea in the last few days. I think for the first time since the 80s or so. And so, do you think there's a real danger of war in this time? And
Yes.
how do you see the struggle for peace as related to this struggle for a new democracy within the US?
Yes. The probabilities of war are higher than they've ever been since the end of World War II. It is a dangerous situation. Of course, the US and the West are losing in Ukraine.
Right.
Some of them are prepared to take that loss and pivot to China and East Asia. This attempt to contain China and surrounding China and North Korea with military bases and nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers and submarines and on, is what we call brinksmanship, taking humanity to the brink, and then from the standpoint of the US neocons, then saying, now what are you going to do? And, you know, there was this, this idea that if you act crazy enough, saner minds in the world will compromise. That's their policy, to act as crazy and as dangerous as they can, and hope that Xi Jinping and Putin will back down in the name of sanity. I don't think, as was the case with the war in Ukraine, Russia could not back up any further. China cannot back up any further. So it is a dangerous situation. The positive thing is that the American people are war weary. And they're saying over and over and over again, how can you give over $130 billion in 1 year to Ukraine while you're cutting off food assistance, poor and working class? And by the way, when we talk about poverty in the United States, we're talking in the majority of working people, what we call the working poor. So you can have low levels of unemployment, official unemployment, and growing poverty at the same time. Because most workers, including professional workers, like college professors who don't have tenure, live in poverty. So it is one of those moments, as they say, of reckoning, where, and I don't like to think in terms of zero-sum games and all of that, or zero-sum outcomes, but you can't have war and peace at the same time. Either the United States will retreat from its belligerency, begin to roll back the 800 military bases, begin to seek a rapprochement with China and Russia, and by implication, Africa and India, because the war policies against China are policies to contain India. You know, are policies to keep Africa in the grip of neocolonialism. And so you have this difficult moment for Western imperialism, where the European nations are going to have to decide, are you on the side of peace and your own economic development, or will you be tools of the United States and global imperialism? Will you still strive to uphold the dollar, or will you do what Saudi Arabia has done? See, this is where we are. The American people are important players in this.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And therefore, when we talk about the candidacy of Trump, which for many people who don't understand is a bad word, you know, and Robert Kennedy. And let me just, you know, for your audience say, you know, Trump has said time and again in his announcement that he's running for president that the threat to American democracy does not come from China or Russia. It comes from the neocons and the neoliberals and the ruling elite in the United States. That is hugely important. And when he speaks like that, he is really expressing the views of tens of millions of US citizens.
I wanted to kind of change the direction of the conversation and talk about Paul Robeson's music. And many people in India know Robeson through his renditions of the Black spirituals. And it's like I mentioned to you earlier, it's said that Didi Kosami only listened to two artists. One was the Indian classical singer M.S. Subbulakshmi, and the other was Paul Robeson. And I'd like to quote Robeson, if that's okay. Just a short quote. This is from his essay "Songs of My People." He says, "Folk songs are in fact a poetic expression of a people's innermost nature, of the distinctive and multifaceted conditions of its historical journey and experience." And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on the Black spirituals, the context in which they were formed, and the history of their development. And what did it mean for Robeson to sing them on the world stage?
Oh, yes. Wow. And I smile because, the question of a people's songs, folk songs as a narrative. I think that the Black spirituals are the greatest working class narrative in America. It's not just of Black folk. It's not just their opposition to their own enslavement, but it is an expression of the deepest aspirations of working people throughout this country. And, Du Bois called the Negro spirituals a rhythmic narrative of a disappointed people, not always sorrowful, often happy, but at the same time, a rhythmic narrative. Du Bois also said that the Black church, what he called the Black church, he was using it in the broad sense, the spiritual gathering of Africans on the slave plantations precedes on these shores the Black family. For many people, it's very difficult to understand the life world of a people where the family was illegal. It was illegal to have families. However, the slave owners did allow on Sunday, the only day that the slaves didn't have to work, this opportunity for them to gather. And even though they didn't have families, they had a community. It's so interesting because, in a certain sense, when one thinks about it, it inverts the logic and trajectory of Western liberal thinking, which begins with the individual, and then the primary organization after that is the family. For us, we African Americans, the primary organization is the community represented in the Black church. That is why the Black Christianity is not Christianity of the Catholic Church, of the Lutherans, of the Episcopalians, even in a lot of ways of white evangelicals. It is a religion of the oppressed. And therefore, in its most important aspects, it is a religion of liberation. The central theme of Black religion is freedom. It may be spoken of metaphorically. Jesus is in Black religion, as Howard Thurman, when he and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, visited Gandhi. What I'm certain they expressed was that The way Gandhi understood Hinduism and Buddhism in India was the way that we Black folk, have understood religion as an instrument of freedom. And therefore, the songs, the music of the Black church is probably the greatest music ever produced in this country. You know, out of which comes so many musical forms that are associated with American culture. But yes, the Black church in all of its iterations, and I include among the Black churches the African American Muslim mosque. I think the highest expression of that is in the Nation of Islam. Its understanding of religion as having to serve the project of freedom and resistance to oppression. That is what Martin Luther King represented. That is what the civil rights and Black freedom movement represented. And it is logical that all of that comes out of the Black church, because that is our primary institution. That is the strongest glue holding us together. We were not allowed to have families. Rape was legal. I mean, it's hard to understand this sometimes. And so what do a people living under this type of oppression, how do they self-organize? How do they fight for their freedom? And that's what the Black church has represented. And my last point, in these times, sadly, the ruling elite, which has penetrated our by that I mean the Black life world, the life world of Black people, have penetrated with Black people, us with Black people who are beholden to the elite. It has weakened the Black church. And so youth and other people have walked away from the church. But it remains in our hearts and our minds our primary institutions. When people think back to their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, they think back of them in their relationship to the church.
Yeah, and today, I mean, we started watching this TV show. It's like an Indian dance TV show, and many of the young people who come on there, in some way or in one way or another, are trying to imitate Black culture in this time.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean,
Yes.
there's been a link between people in India looking to African Americans, but as you say, the culture that is being kind of spread throughout the world in this time is really a ruling class culture, and the glorification of violence in that culture. And I want to read one more quote from Robeson. He said, "The culture we deal with," and he's talking about artists, "the culture we deal with comes from the people. We have an obligation to take it back to the people, to make them understand that in fighting for their cultural heritage, they fight for peace. They fight for their own rights, for the rights of the Negro people, for the rights of all in this great land." I think that's related to what you were saying just now, Doc.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. You couldn't say it better. And I agree with you, Nanditha. Those words are sorely needed in this time.
Okay, well, I have one last question for you, and that has to do with Robeson's work as a philosopher. And, he has some writings which you introduced me to, on how he saw human beings and their creative capacity to create art, but also to build a new society. And I just want to read one more thing from him, where he's talking about Western science. And he says, Now, I am not going to belittle the achievements of science. Only a fool would deny that the man who holds the secrets of those holds the key position in the world. I'm simply going to ask, having found the key, has Western man, Western bourgeois man, sufficient strength left to turn it in the lock? Or is he going to find that in the search he has so exhausted his vitality that he will have to call in the cooperation of his more virile, quote, inferiors, Eastern or Western, before he can open the door and enter into his heritage? And, I think this is so important. This idea is so important today because we're living in a time where artificial intelligence has brought into question the very nature of what is human.
That's
Uh,
right.
and this claim that is being made uh, by the ruling elite in the West that artificial intelligence will take on human being like characteristics, and we will no longer need human beings, essentially. So I was wondering if you could speak to this and how Robeson's ideas can inform our thinking in this time.
Well, as you know, Nanditha, we in the Free School are going to establish a multinational dialogue on some of these questions, uh, hopefully in the beginning of June. You know, but of course, I compare the question and the debates around artificial intelligence to the unresolved debates around quantum physics and string theory. In fact, to make the question of artificial intelligence merely a matter of technologies and algorithms is a bad joke. These are philosophical questions which get to the very heart of what is human and what is humanity and what is art and what is creativity and what is imagination and what can humans do to improve their lot in the world. In the Saturday Free School, we go between social theory and social science and philosophy and natural science. We're trying to find a way to think through these great challenges to revolutionary possibility and revolutionary trajectories, to think through those embracing the revolutionary possibilities against the anti-revolutionary theories that are always being put forward every few years, and you know this, having lived in the United States, that the ideological environment is always producing new things. It's really a rich ideological environment with a lot of wrong theories. But you have to live, drink, think, eat ideas to keep up with what's going on here. And this AI debate is just the recent iteration of an attack upon the possibility of a revolutionary struggle for people's democracy and for peace. A machine intelligence, even if you download the whole internet and make it the empirical foundation of innovation, thought, and creativity, the whole internet, you have still not produced a substitute for humanity. Because the internet itself and the information therein is a result of human production and human creativity, beginning with ordinary people. So I consider this whole discussion of AI, which is dominated by people who have graduated or are professors at places like MIT or the University of California, this, that, or the other one of their universities. This is an elite discourse, and it is a discourse that is constructed by people who do not have any sympathy for the working people, themselves don't know poverty, do not know the violence of the day-to-day lives of many working class communities. So yeah, they want to find a substitute for humanity while saying, oh, this is a danger to civilization. In the back of their minds, they want a substitute for humanity because they feel that human beings are so flawed, or as Hillary Clinton said, a basket of deplorables.
Right.
You know, and if we can find a quote substitute for all of those people, working people in the first place, that are turning their backs on the ruling elite, that would be a good thing from their point of view. But we have to take it on. In fact, I don't think it is going to be as hard as some think. The problem with why the philosophical questions of particle physics have not been solved and why theoretical physics is in the terrible state that it's in is because, and it isn't a terrible, it's almost unbelievable, is because the from the World War II and the rise of Nazism and then the Cold War submerged the possibility or undermined the possibility of a philosophical resolution to questions that a lot of physicists thought they could resolve through experimentation and mathematics. There has to be a philosophical, what I would call a categorical way to rethink the questions of particle physics, wave, particle, whatever. You guys know this better than me. But with AI, I think it is a greater existential threat in the sense that here you have these entrepreneurs who are selling themselves, selling this, quote, new technology, to get rich. They see themselves as the next Bill Gates or whatever, or Zuckerberg. So they're selling themselves and they're trying to get money, investment, and so on. But in the process, they're putting forward ideas, and this is the key thing, the ideological struggle around AI. These are ideological arguments. These are not technological arguments in the main, and so we have to take it on in the name of the people, in the name of peace, in the name of democracy.
Okay, well, on that note, I'd just like to thank you, Doc, again for taking out the time to speak with us. And we hope that this can be a small contribution in keeping the memory of a man as great as Paul Robeson alive. And there was a time when, he was probably the most well-known African-American person.
Absolutely.
And I feel it is so important for people to know his name today. And so thank you, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Nandita.